Hello, good people. Back with another episode, and today I want to talk about my simplified 3-component travel photography setup. And before I go into the different components and how they all fit together, I want to wax poetic for a second, if you'll permit me, and basically talk about your philosophy on photography. And if you have a smartphone, you love it, you take great pictures with it, it brings you joy when you look at your images, however you store them, however you share them, it just brings you happiness, then turn this video off right now. There's no need to look at different gear, look at the way I do something and say, hey, I need to stop doing what I'm doing and do what this joker on the internet is doing, because that's not how you enjoy photography. The purpose of photography is to create images that bring you happiness, that you share, that when you look at 5 years from now, bring back a happy memory, instead of getting obsessed with gear and buying a bunch of stuff that's challenging to use, that's frustrating, that makes you want to put it up on a shelf and have it collect dust versus take it out and use it and enjoy it. And I use my iPhone quite a bit to take pictures, but frankly, I'm not as good as other people with the iPhone. My wife is spectacular with the iPhone. If you put us in the same room, particularly with our kids, and we each took 100 pictures, my wife would have 30 keepers, I'd have 2 if I was lucky. And I'm not sure if she just has this innate ability to connect with our children and anticipate when they're going to do something interesting and hit the shutter button at the exact moment. I'm not sure if she's just better at the tool than I am, but for whatever reason, I am better with a real camera than an iPhone, both in terms of snapshots and when I'm out on a trip, when I'm on some sort of adventure, and I'm trying to capture landscapes, buildings, people, and just capture a sense of that place that I was at. So years, days, months later, I can look back on those pictures and get that feeling of joy. And that, I believe, is what photography is all about. So if the iPhone or the phones or whatever camera you have today isn't cutting it for you, if maybe you're on the other side of that spectrum and you have that gigantic DSLR with the huge lenses and this, Sherpa expedition quality backpack that you have to carry all that junk in, and it's so tedious and so heavy, it's such a pain in the butt to set up that you find yourself either A, not bringing it, or B, when there's a moment in front of you that's interesting, you're spending 5 minutes looking down and fiddling with dials and lenses that you miss it. This, for me, has been a great compromise. So let's talk through the pieces. So the first piece, kind of obvious piece, is the camera. And I love this camera. It's a Fujifilm X100V. I guess for whatever reason it fits in the point and shoot category since it's got a fixed lens. It's got a 23mm, I believe. Yeah, 23mm Fuji lens. Great lens, it's beautiful. There's no zoom. There's no question of which lens do I put on this thing. There's no question of, do I zoom in or out? If I want to zoom, I walk forward or backward. But it's a great focal length for landscape, for street photography, for snapshots. Just produces absolutely beautiful images. And it takes away that element of having to worry about, which lens am I going to bring to the party. The other thing I love about this camera, it's got all the key manual features. They're sensibly located, they're easy to use. You've got an aperture ring out here, you can control your aperture super easily. There's a manual focus ring if you want to do that. Generally, I find the autofocus is good enough that I don't need to worry about it. You've got an exposure compensation dial right by your thumb, so you can quickly tweak your exposure up and down. You've got a nice shutter speed button, super easy to use. And then, a little tiny bit buried, but still very accessible, is your ISO or your ASA or your film speed, whatever you want to call it. And you get to that by lifting up that shutter speed button. I'm not going to go into super depth on all these features. There's a zillion overly detailed reviews on this camera, but I just like that everything's at your fingertips. All those manual controls. You can turn certain controls into auto if you want, let the camera worry about it. If I'm out taking pictures of landscapes, I'm primarily concerned with my aperture. Just throw everything else on auto and kind of get the creative elements and vision I want using that aperture and exposure comp. Let the camera do everything else, and it generally comes out really nicely. The camera's just got this great build quality to it, and whenever you read or listen to a review about this camera, you're gonna see people talk about that, and it might get a little tedious or weird, but it's metal, it just feels good in your hands. It's something that you pick up and it has that solid feel. It's like picking up a Rolex versus a Timex. There's just this kind of heft to it, this precision engineering, and just this all around good feeling that, again, makes me kind of want to pick this up and take some pictures. Makes me, when I see it on the shelf, get a smile on my face and say, can I take this off the shelf and go take some pictures with it? On the digital side, some of the things that I like about it, it has film modes, which I thought were really gimmicky. They're essentially digital versions of several of Fuji's iconic films. Provia, Velvia, Astra, all the films you may remember if you're a film photographer. And I thought, hey, that's gimmicky. I can do the same thing myself with tweaking settings in Lightroom. But they do really bring a film-like quality and bring some of those old films back to life. And you could very easily in Lightroom or whatever editing program you use, select those film looks, even when you're shooting from RAW. And it just brings a nice ability to have a new creative tool at your disposal when you go and make those images. Second element of my travel photography setup is probably the simplest. It's this card reader from a company called Vogek, V-O-G-E-K, some weird anonymous company that I found on Amazon. I'll put a link to the description as usual, but it'll take the micro SD cards and the mini SD cards. It's got USB-C on one end, so it'll read those cards quite quickly. The other end has standard USB, and then if you fold it just right, mini USB. So you can read your memory cards on pretty much any camera, an iPad, any computer. The only thing you can't really read them on is a iPhone, since it has that lightning connector. Maybe someday Apple will join the rest of the universe and put in USB-C. Until that time, what I primarily use when I'm out traveling is my iPad. This, again, has USB-C, will plug right into the bottom of the iPad, and I use Adobe Lightroom Mobile, which I think is fantastic. There's a lot of applications that I have on desktop and on iPad, and one is just sort of, I put a lot of the Microsoft programs in that category, although they're getting better, but Microsoft Word on the desktop, spectacular. You get on the iPad and you're kind of like, this is just sort of it's 60% of the experience, which is usually good enough, but when you need that other 40%, it's a little bit of a challenge. Lightroom on the iPad, conversely, they have a different version, and they really went through it thoughtfully and designed it with I think very intentionally for a tablet type device and that finger-based device. So even if I'm out on a vacation with my family, even when I've been out on bicycle or camping trips, if I have some downtime, I can very easily take the card out of the camera, throw it in this guy, plug it into the bottom of the iPad. It'll suck down all my images. It'll send them up to the cloud. That can take quite a while if you're out on cellular service or you're in another country and there's less than high quality Wi-Fi. But it does give you a backup of all your images, starts to back them up to the cloud, lets you edit them very intuitively. And what I find myself doing, particularly when I'm out on a trip, is you can go flip through your images and kind of pick the ones that you like and want to do something with in the future, reject the ones that are just absolute garbage, things that are out of focus and whatnot, and start to do some of that cataloging and weeding out of your images before you get back from your trip. And then, if I'm on the plane, I may do some editing. If I have a little bit of downtime, I may do some editing. And it gets you from moment to edited final image much faster. That was one of my big challenges in the DSLR era. You'd spend all this time taking images and worrying about your exposure and all this stuff. And then you'd have to take the cards back to your computer. You'd have to plug in all sorts of adapters and download them. And you'd have, in some cases, 3,000 images. And it was so much work and such a daunting task to go through them, especially as a non-professional photographer, that I'd delay that activity, sometimes for months. And it would just, there'd be no value to my photographs. They'd be sitting in a card or on a hard drive somewhere, not being looked at, not being shared, not, sometimes getting printed and put on the wall. With this simple setup, I can go from seeing the image to having a final product that's good enough, to having the ability to integrate with all of the smartphone universe of connected applications. That makes it much better. So I edit my photo in Lightroom. There's the typical iOS share button. I assume there's something similar for Android, but I can shoot that photo as a text. I can drop it on Insta. I can email it to people. I can send it to a digital frame we have in our house and get that joy from that photo much faster than I previously could. The other great thing about this setup, it's small enough that you can throw it in the bag quite easily. When I go on a work trip, I'm already bringing my iPad, adding in this guy, and this I actually keep in my work bag. I have 3 or 4 of these just in case I need to read something off a memory card, but throwing this camera in, relatively easy. I'll go if I'm in an interesting city, maybe just walking home from work if the sun's setting, I'll take a few pictures. If I see something interesting, I'll take a few pictures. And it really lets you start to do photography anywhere and have that level of control and creativity that I like with a real camera versus an iPhone, but without having the overbearing set of lenses and equipment that you have to bring with you. So if you're in the market for simplifying your photographic gear, or you're in the market for something that's a little bit more than an iPhone, strongly recommend you check out this Fujifilm X100V. There's similar cameras on the market. I agonized over this versus Canons versus Sonys versus Nikon. A lot of companies are coming out with a mirrorless type format and something that's smaller and kind of in this, you know, classic rangefinder type look. I think a lot of companies have gotten a little more focused on how do I make something that looks nice and, you know, feels nice in the hand versus just cramming in as many features as humanly possible. But from my research, Fuji really nailed it. They did some of the best design of most of the other companies. I find their menus are not very beautiful, but pretty straightforward. It's easy to find everything. The camera's wildly customizable. There's, you know, 5 or 6 different buttons that you can change what they do, change how they operate, add features and functions that you like and are specific to how you take pictures. And it just makes it more of that device you can pick up. You can be ready to shoot. It feels good in your hand. You know, it's got the features you want right up front. Just by way of example, I have a button set up to turn face detection on and off. So if the kids are doing something cool, I'll pick it up, turn on face detection, makes the focusing a lot easier. I have another button for the neutral density filter that's built in. So if I'm taking a landscape shot, I can have that in one finger press and I know exactly where the button is and all that. So highly recommend at least put this on your list of cameras to check out. If you want to get into that simplified gear type philosophy, highly recommend, particularly if you've used Lightroom on your computer, checking out Lightroom for the tablet. And then, you know, this guy's $5-10. I wish you could get a volume discount because I'd buy a half dozen of them and just throw them in every bag I have. And it gets you to that point where you get from image to shared much faster. So hopefully this was helpful. Take great pictures, enjoy them. You know, even if you sat through this whole thing and said, I absolutely want none of this garbage, just let me stick with my phone. You do you, and don't let someone else tell you that you should be doing it differently because you're doing absolutely the right thing. Be well, and I'll see you next time. Peace.